Anna wrote her MA thesis on Sigrid Undset, who received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1928. But Sigrid Undset, Anna Moser. Thank you. I realized I had to think back a little. I realized that I did graduate from Portland State 30 years ago, and I can't believe it's that long. Walking through the hallways here, it really didn't seem that long ago, and I felt as lost as I who you are. Are you, most of you, from the Scandinavian community, or are you associated with the university, or who are you? Are you, okay, any students from Portland State? Okay. All right. Well, I'd also like to tell you that after my family moved from northern Norway, from the little island called Bjarkøy, we moved to a town called Sandefjord, which is on the west side of Oslofjord. And in those days, in the 50s, it was kind of the whaling capital of Norway. Norway was still doing whaling in those days. And I remember one day my father came home with a copy of the biggest newspaper in Norway. It was called Aftenposten, and the headline on the front page said, "All the cars in Bjarkøy collided." And of course, people in the rest of the country didn't know that there were only 2 cars on the island, and it sounded terrific. It sounded horrible. But what happened is that once a day the ferry came, and those 2 cars would go down to where the ferry came, and they would transport people and things. And there was a curve right there, and one was going up the island and the other down to the ferry. That's how that happened. Sigrid Undset. Her name is pronounced Sigrid Undset in Norwegian. I will call her Sigrid Undset for the purposes of our conversation today. And to most Americans, she is an obscure author. However, to Norwegians, she is considered one of the country's greatest author. She was the 3rd Norwegian to receive a Nobel Prize in literature, and she was the first woman. Do any of you know who the first 2 authors were? Norwegian. The first. Got a Nobel Prize? Yes, in literature.
Ibsen?
Ibsen never did. Bjørnson and Hamsun. That's right. Right. And Sigrid wrote 33 books and several hundred articles on many subjects. She received the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1928 for 2 books. The first one, 3 volumes in that, and the other one, Master of Hestviken, and that's a 4-volume novel. And these books have been translated to over 70 languages, and they are read all over the world. But still, my experience in this country is that she is not well known. She's well known in certain circles, and actually I found that the place where she's best known in Oregon is in Mount Angel, at the Abbey at the Mount Angel. Her novels are considered historical, not strong theological and spiritual stories are placed within a realistic context in Norway in the 13th and 14th centuries. And that time, by the way, was Norway's, the Catholic Church's most prominent position in the country, when the church was the strongest. And that was the period she wrote about. My first experience with Sigrid Undset was as a high school student in Norway, when her Kristin Lavransdatter was required reading. We read only the first volume. The second and third I did not read until I was an adult and was in this country, and needed to find a Norwegian woman thing to do. And someone reminded me that Sigrid Undset actually was a Catholic. Norway, by the way. It is true that Sigrid Undset is considered a great author by experts in the field. It is also true that she is considered the 20th century's most important Catholic female author, another thing that is not mentioned in Norway a lot. As a young person, considered herself an agnostic, and she was proud of it, and she expressed it very willingly. It is also really strange that she, an agnostic and living in Norway, became a Catholic. And at the end of her life, her faith in God and her love for God and her family were the most important things in her life. I want you to know right up front that I'm speaking to you as a theologian and not as a professor in literature. My perspective is as a theologian, and that's the perspective. When I talk about theology, in a sense, we're all theologians, whether we know it or not. But theology is words or expressions about God and our relationship with God. So anytime we talk about God, we are really speaking as... So I'm no expert in literature, and I know very little about God also. But we ask the questions, and we spend our lives trying to understand our relationship with God and how that relates to our relationships between us as people. It is interesting, by the way, concerning her Sigrid Undset's stand and her becoming a Catholic, that a few years ago, when Norwegian, the country, celebrated 100 years since her birth, people were still expressing that I couldn't understand how she could become a Catholic. And they felt that, in fact, one of the authors who wrote a biography on her said that it didn't make sense theologically or socially, that she seemed to be out of step with her times. And of course, Sigrid felt exactly the opposite, that she understood. However, if we wish to place Sigrid Undset in a category with other authors, she belongs with people like Graham Greene, Evelyn Waugh, and G.K. Chesterton, who also were people who converted to the Catholic faith. And they were 20th century intellectuals. The male authors than Sigrid Undset is, and I think perhaps one of the reasons is because they wrote in English, and she wrote in Norwegian, which is a language that is spoken by only about 4 or 5 million people, 4 or 5 million by this time. Sigrid had a very good understanding of human nature. She was a realist, and she was a female author who wrote with great insight about men and women alike. And her favorite subject was the relationship between men and women. Authors who know her well, experts in literature, say that she was rather exceptional because she was able to write about men and women equally well. She understood men as well as she understood women, and so her books are really not chick books. They are books that relate to all people. And all ages. And actually, her first book, the Bridal Wreath, the first volume in Kristin Lavransdatter, is a wonderful book for teenagers and young people in high school. The next book is a wonderful book for, and in the book, Kristin is only 49 years old when she dies, but that was considered old in the 13th and 14th century, or the 14th century, which is when Kristin lived, so supposedly. So go through life. Sigrid Undset really demonstrated her ability to write about men very well in the second book that she won the Nobel Prize for, which was Master of Hestviken. And that book, the main person is a man. The main character is a man. She herself liked that book or that novel better than she liked Kristin Lavransdatter. It's probably the book that is most famous and she's most known for. Sigrid spent her life seeking truth about life itself, about women and men, about relationships, and about God. And her special gift was storytelling. And it was in her nature to share by telling stories through her written word, and also she was a wonderful storyteller to her friends. And telling stories and writing stories was part of the process that she used to seek truth. Both Kristin Lavransdatter and Master of Hestviken are novels that contain timeless truths. And in these books, Sigrid wrote about God, she wrote about relationships, she wrote about love and marriage, sexuality, parenthood, suffering, joy, war, peace, birth, and death, all the things that we want to find in a good novel. How many of you have read her novel? Which one have you read? Kristin? Okay. There is a certain incompatibility between the Norwegian language and the English language. And especially between Norwegian names and the English language. And I know that many people find the 3 first pages in Kristin Lavransdatter difficult to get through. But after you get through those pages, you are in a wonderful world. And I suggest, and actually I had to do that myself as a young girl when I first read her book. It's a good idea to have a piece of paper and a pencil and start writing down the names and to keep track of it. And use that piece of paper as your bookmark. After all, in the book, Kristin has 7 sons. It's really difficult to keep track of all these names, plus all the other names. There is one thing I hate to admit about Sigrid Undset, and that is that she was not born in Norway. And I hate to say this, but she was actually born in Denmark.
That makes her even better.
Depends on your perspective, doesn't it? Well, her mother was Danish and her father was Norwegian, and she was born in Denmark in 1880 in Norway, and she was a Norwegian citizen, and she loved that country. She loved Denmark too. There is no doubt about it. As you probably know, she established her home, the home that she loved in Lillehammer, in the town where the Olympics, the Winter Olympics, were held in 1994. Sigrid was not raised in a religious environment. Her parents considered themselves atheists. And they were among the intellectual elite in Norway, actually, in the latter part of the 19th century. Sigrid's father was an archaeologist, and he was a prominent member of the University of Oslo. His wife and Sigrid's mother was his professional helper and assistant, and at the same time as she played the traditional role of mother and wife. Already as a young girl, Sigrid was an independent thinker because she was encouraged to be an independent thinker by her parents. And she was also a keen observer of people and her environment. As a teenager already, she declared herself an agnostic. She said she thought that the Norwegian Lutheran Church was just a pretty ruin standing somewhere in the background of society. And she confided to a friend that she was grateful for having been raised in a home with a healthy, non-Christian atmosphere. Her early childhood was happy. She had a good home. Her grandparents on her father's side, however, were traditional Christian, good Lutherans, and she did encounter Christianity through them. Her father also took her to visit Nidaros Cathedral in Trondheim, and this cathedral was built in the 12th century. It was burned, rebuilt, but it's the grandest example of medieval church in Norway. And her father had taken her there and talked to her about it and explained the background of it. And so she had developed a respect and a love for what is old. And Sigrid and her father were very close. However, he died when she was 11 years old. And his death transformed her life and the life of her family totally. And the family was devastated emotionally and financially. Sigrid had adored her father, and he had encouraged her to read and had kindled in her an interest for history, archaeology, and literature. And he had even challenged her to read material that she was too young to read. And when he was dying, he asked her to read to him Icelandic poetry. She did not speak Icelandic, but she sat on his bed and read these sagas for him in the Icelandic language. Now you need to understand that Icelandic is, Norwegian is certainly related to it, and Norwegian is based on it. So in many ways we can understand some of foreign language to Norwegians. And for the rest of her life, Sigrid enjoyed Icelandic sagas, Danish sagas, and she loved poetry. And so Sigrid became a reader. She read everything. And she had an amazing memory and an amazing intellect and an amazing curiosity. She was an excellent student, of course. And she was given a scholarship after grade school to a progressive and liberal girls' school in Norway. But she was not interested in it. There she was encouraged to think independently, but she soon found out that she only was encouraged to think within their framework, the school's framework of independent thinking. And she needed to think outside the box. And so when she was 17, she was finished with her formal education. She never attended a university, but she continued to educate herself independently. She found, at the age 17, she found a job as a secretary for a German firm in Oslo, and she worked there for 10 years. She was a lonely young woman. She was kind of an awkward young woman. She was beautiful, but she did not have the same kind of social skills that other young women did, perhaps because she was too serious, too scholarly. She was grieving her father's death. She learned to master English, German, and Italian. I like Sigrid Undset very much, and the more I learn about her, the more I like her and the more fascinating I find her. I like her because she's brilliant and interesting and extraordinary, but I also like her because she is very ordinary. She was extraordinary because she had a genius for language, her own language, Norwegian, and it's wonderful to be able to read her books in Norwegian, and it took me many, many years before I could read Kristin Lavransdatter in English, but I had to before I wrote my master's thesis. She was a deep thinker, she was a historian, and she was a theologian, all educated on her own. She was a sophisticated person in the sense that she was brought up well by her parents, and she was a world traveler. She was a person of integrity and honesty, And she was not the least impressed by money or titles. She had a wonderful sense of beauty. She loved art. She was unpretentious, and she was very generous. She was a woman of great spirituality and faith, and she was religious of nature, but she was not necessarily pious. She was a realist, a person who understands real life, but she also had a sense of the holy. She was ordinary in the sense that she made really dumb mistakes. She made the same kinds of mistakes, human mistakes we all make. She was very rich, and it didn't really make that much difference. She suffered greatly. She could be terribly arrogant and impatient with people. She was beautiful, but she was unsuccessful in romance. She had a disastrous marriage. She felt like a failure because of that marriage. She ate too much, said she drank too much. She was a chain smoker, and she did not take care of herself well physically. She was not in good physical health. She was a master of the written word, but she could also swear like a sailor. She was ordinary in the sense that she enjoyed ordinary things like cooking and gardening, and she loved being a mother. She was a good mother. While she was a secretary between the age of 17 and 27, she started walking around the streets of Oslo and observing life around her. And she observed especially the life of the poor people. She observed the lives of the young women that she worked with. And she observed their struggles. And she observed injustice, and this made her angry. So she started writing articles for the newspapers in Oslo, and she was published. And the more she was published, the more she gained confidence. She wrote a book, and she had been thinking about this for a long, long time, actually. And it was a historic times. But she was too shy and uncomfortable to take it to a publisher. She shared the book with her younger sister, who thought it was terrific. She really liked it. So her younger sister put on her best hat and her best dress and walked to the publisher's office and handed it in to the publisher. It took the publisher about a month. He read it, contacted Sigrid, and rejected the book. And he said, you have potential, but I suggest that you do not write historical stuff, you write something modern. And Sigrid actually was grateful for the advice, and so she was inspired, and she wrote a book called Mrs. Martha Auli. And the first sentence of that book was, "I have been unfaithful to my husband." And she figured that was modern enough. And the book was published. And the year was 1907, and she was 25 years old. She was unmarried. She had not really had any experience with romance. And she was a published author. She continued to write, and soon the publishing establishment in Oslo recognized her, and she was, as was the custom in those days, prominent artists are given a grant by the government, and she was given such a grant. And that grant, and also having published a book, what made it possible for her to quit her job as a secretary, and that was in 1909. So already 2 years after her first published book, she was an established author. And she was now able to devote all her time to her craft. And so this money she had earned, took with her, and left Norway. Norway has never been a great place for artists. Artists and scientists and people who want to learn have often gone to Paris, to Copenhagen, favorite place for Norwegians to go and study. And artists would go to Italy. And so Sigrid Undset went to Rome, where there was a whole colony of Scandinavian artists of different types who had formed a community. And she very soon became a favorite in that Scandinavian community in Rome. And from now on, this sad and lonely secretary from Oslo was now a celebrated young author and storyteller. Her friends, first time in her life she really had friends, would tell stories, often stories from the Middle Ages. Life was good, exciting, and romantic at last. And it was in this period, in 1910, that Sigrid met a Norwegian painter by the name of Arne Svarstad. And they very soon became lovers. He was the most interesting and intelligent man she had ever met. However, there was just one problem. He was married and he had 3 children, and he was about 13 years older than she was. And of course, in those days, getting a divorce was a great shame, and it also was very difficult for women, especially because women didn't have careers. So Sigrid wasn't necessarily proud of this, but not have the courage to tell her her mother what had happened to her. This was a lovely period for her, and I brought, I had copies taken of a couple of paintings that her future husband painted of her, and I can send this around. But this one is painted at Easter time in Rome, and Sigrid had a new Easter bonnet. And then this painting was painted later of her when the 2 of them lived in London when they were newlyweds. And both paintings are now hanging in museums in Norway. Sigrid ended up returning to Norway because of circumstances. Their relationship became kind of scandalous and difficult. So they decided, while he applied for a divorce. He wanted to divorce his wife, started that process, but in order to avoid too much of a scandal, Sigrid moved back to Norway, where she continued writing, and she wrote a book called Jenny. And some of you might have heard of it. It's about a young woman who goes to Rome, and this woman has a love affair, first with a young man and then with the father of the young man, or maybe it was the other way around, I can't remember. But it was pretty scandalous, this book, and it caused quite a discussion in Norway. And this was, by the way, at a time when Norwegian women were trying to gain the right to vote, which they were given or achieved in 1913. And Norway, by the way, was the first European country to allow women to vote. Sigrid did not get too involved in that. She did not consider herself the women's movement in Norway at that time. Arne Svarstad's divorce was final, and the 2 of them were married in Belgium in 1912. And by that time, Sigrid was pregnant with their first child. They lived in London for a while, and that's when he painted that second painting, and they had a lovely time there. She wrote, he painted. Then they moved back to Rome, and they wanted to be in the same building where they had had the love affair and when they had first met, and that's where they wanted their son to be born, or their child to be born. And so their first child was born there in January of 1913. His name was Anders. But the child was not doing well there, and so Sigrid ended up having to take the child with her and go to Norway after just a few months. And Arne Svarstad, her husband, stayed in Rome. Now this was also a very typical. Artists would travel, and already this early in their marriage, his art had higher priority than their marriage. So she took the child, went to Norway, established a household, and then he followed. The husband continues to live as an artist and to travel. Their second child was born in 1915, and this child was a little daughter, and it soon became apparent that she was not a healthy child. She was handicapped both mentally and physically. As it turned out, already Arne Svarstad had 3 children. His second child by his first wife had the same type of handicaps. Now, when he was divorced from his first wife, the children were put in an orphanage because the wife was not able to take care of them. She had no job, no means of supporting children. And of course, Sigrid felt very bad about this. And being really a very domestic person and also loving children, she soon started bringing his children from his first marriage into her home. And pretty soon, there she was, the mother of 2 little kids plus the 3 children from his first marriage, and she took care of all of them while he was traveling still and painting and so forth. Sigrid continued to write, amazingly enough. And you also have to remember at this time, the early, and this was between 1910 and 1920, there were no modern conveniences, really, compared to what we have today. So housekeeping was really very difficult. And then there were all the Norwegian traditions of preparing all the cookies and the meats and all that kind of stuff at the holidays, and she tried to do all that. She stayed up at night. She took care of her children and her house during the day, and she wrote at night. And she stayed awake by smoking cigarettes and drinking coffee. The family moved to a bigger house for a while, and then they rented this house, and then they were told they needed to leave the house because the landlord needed it. And this was in now 1919. They had been married from 1912 to 1919. They had 2 children. She was pregnant again, and she decided that she wanted to take the family and move out of Oslo and north to Lillehammer. So she found a house and rented that house, and this move really was kind of the last move out of the marriage. By this time already their marriage was over. And he never joined them in Lillehammer, and from that day on, from that period on, she was a single mother with 3 children. But this also became her most productive time. And in a way, her happiest time. She was devastated that her marriage didn't last. And she made a comment that she spoke about a lifetime of penance for a moment of ecstasy. And I think that's a pretty good description of the rest of her life in a way, from a marital point of view. Okay, Kristin Lavransdatter. The first book, The Bridal Wreath, was published in 1920. And it's that volume is a romantic volume. About a medieval knight and a young innocent maiden. And the book explores human nature and natural forces in nature. Of the 3 volumes, this is the most lyrical and the most thrillingly romantic in content. And this is the book, of course, that is the volume that's the most famous, and this is the book that a movie has been made. You might have heard of it or even seen it. It was made by Liv Ullmann, the Norwegian actress. Oh, you saw it here. Okay. but that's only a third of the whole masterpiece. The second volume came out already in 1921, and this is The Mysteries of Huseby, and this is a book more about marriage. It's more of a psychological type of a book, and it examines closely the tensions and the difficulties in marriage and the complicated relationships within families. It's also a wonderful description of culture and the social elements of that period in Norway. Kristin Lavransdatter starts in the early 1300s, like 1305, and Kristin dies about 1350. The third volume came out in 1922, and it's called The Cross. And this volume can best be described as a religious novel. And the story takes place from young adulthood to the end of Kristin's life. And of course, with these books, Sigrid had gained respect and recognition as an author in Norway. The novels were very well received in the Scandinavian countries and also in Europe. It took a little longer because they had to be translated. They were very well received in Germany, which is considered a Catholic country. Sigrid Undset was a typical Nordic personality in the sense that she was very private and reticent and reluctant to tell about herself. So she really did not write an autobiography. But there are obvious parallels between Sigrid Undset and Kristin Lavransdatter. So in a way, I think Kristin Lavransdatter is Sigrid Undset's autobiography. Both Kristin and Sigrid adore their fathers. And Sigrid dedicated the second volume of Kristin Lavransdatter to her father. His name was Ingvald Undset. And Kristin's father was kind of the embodiment of righteous living and goodness. And through him, through Lavrans, Kristin's father, Sigrid pays tribute to her own father. Sigrid's father died early. Kristin's father did not. He lived a good long life. Still, it is clear that Lavrans is the person that is an image of Sigrid's father, and Lavrans is the one who kind of is an image of God also, and who loves unconditionally and who forgives Kristin even when she cheats and lies and manipulates him. He never gives up on her, and he always forgives her. He's practically perfect, actually, as a human being, and he's almost like a saint. And also, I believe that through writing this second volume of Kristin Lavransdatter, that this was an opportunity for Sigrid to grieve her father, grieve the death of her father. And in one scene where she describes Kristin and her father having, Kristin had visited her father Lavrans. He was sick and they knew he was going to die soon. And Kristin had to leave him at his farm and return to her own farm. And Sigrid describes this farewell scene between them, and it's very dramatic and very emotional. And I believe that through that type of writing, Sigrid was able to express her own grief and her own feelings about her father. Of course, there are other similarities between Sigrid and Kristin. Both fell in love with and married men who were 12 to 13 years their senior. Both the men were men who had fathered children in previous relationships. And in a sense, for that reason, both marriages were built on the ruins of another family. Both Kristin and Sigrid lost their husbands to separation and death, and they both lost children to death. It's also kind of interesting to note, and this is kind of strange, that Kristin's death and Sigrid's manner of dying, so it's almost as if she describes her own death in the novel, and I'll get back to that. At the end of her life, the fictional character of Kristin had lost her husband and several of her children to death, and she had lost many of her personal possessions and property because of the plague, the Black Death. And Sigrid describes this really well. And if you read this novel, remember that the historical facts are facts. They are accurate. The Black Death came to Norway in 1349, and at that time there were 500,000 people living in Norway. A third of the entire population died through the Black Death. The Catholic Church, or the church, was strong in Norway. In the diocese of Nidaros, which is Trondheim, where the cathedral was, there were 300 priests in that diocese. Only 40 remained after the Black Death was over, and the archbishop died. And the situation was similar in other dioceses in the country, and that was so because priests and nuns were the ones who were kind of the doctors and nurses and took care of the sick people. Sigrid describes that on her deathbed, Kristin was nursed and taken care of by Benedictine nuns. What is interesting is that when Sigrid was dying, she was being nursed and taken care of by nuns in Lillehammer, in the hospital in Lillehammer. And like Kristin, at the end of her life, Sigrid had lost her husband and her children, and she was a very lonely woman, just like Kristin was. However, like Kristin, she had her faith in God, and she had hope. In this period between 1920 and until 1930, Sigrid continued to write. And she also wrote, of course, the 4 volumes, Master of Hestviken. And this was the work that she herself enjoyed the most and was the most proud of. These were the happiest years, really, of her life. And she was surrounded there by family and friends. I just want to talk to you a little about how she was converted to the Catholic Church. And actually, it's apparent, or the Catholic faith, I should say. It's apparent that it was because of her own studies that she did in historical studies. And she said that through her research, she had found the people, God's people, the saints, she said, who were the sanest people that she had encountered. And she wanted to find what was true. She always sought truth. And it was in these people and the ordinary religious people, especially that she found in the history from the Middle Ages, that she wanted to be like them, and she felt that they had found the truth. And so she said that, and she wanted also to believe in something that was larger than her. That there had to be something more to life than just what I want. And so she said that she had to learn to accept a force a force larger than herself. And she acknowledged that we make a decision because of our will to give ourselves to the power of God. These are her words. And to be freed from what she called the hell of egotism, and from the shackles of self-worship to face eternal possibilities. That was kind of at the core of her conversion. Being a historian, Sigrid Undset understood current events. And in the 1930s, she traveled quite a lot to Germany. She was invited there because she was now a Nobel Prize-winning author. She got the Nobel Prize in 1928. And by the way, she gave away all the prize money. She established a fund for families who had handicapped children so that they could get help taking care of their children in their homes. But she had observed developments in Germany, and she was her outspoken self, and she wrote articles in German newspapers and in Norway also, speaking against the development in Germany. And of course this made her very unpopular, and after a while she was not invited back to Germany. When Norway was invaded in April of 1940, it became clear that she was in danger, and it was normal for Germans, when they invaded a country, to capture famous and prominent people and use them for propaganda purposes. And this was why they wanted to get hold of Sigrid. So she needed to flee. And with the help of friends, she just grabbed a few things and left her home just 2-3 days after the Germans had invaded Norway, and they were coming north. They were coming close to Lillehammer. So she fled by car north, ended up with her friends in a little shipping boat. They were sailing north along the Norwegian coast, to northern Norway, to the Lofoten area, where they left the fishing boat and then started walking across the country in the narrow part towards Sweden, which was a neutral country. This was, of course, a hardship for her, and she had great difficulties. They had some young men helping them, and she ended up sitting on a sled. She wore a dress and a fur coat and boots. And was brought to Sweden across the border safely. All of them were. Then she was now in northern Sweden, took the train to Stockholm, where her sister lived, and where she found out that her oldest son Anders had been killed in the fights not too far from Lillehammer, from their home. She was there joined by her younger son. Her daughter, by the way, by this time had died. Her daughter had died in 1939. And so Sigrid and her younger son continued from Stockholm by train to Moscow, continued from Moscow to Tokyo, from Tokyo to San Francisco by ship, and from San Francisco to New York, where she spent the 5 years of the war. That's where she lived, and she liked it there. In fact, before the war, she had been invited by her American publisher to come to the United States to give lectures. And so she had already been in conversation with them, and while she was in the United States, she did travel quite a lot across this country, and she gave lectures at universities and at churches. And she came to Oregon. She was at Mount Angel, where she was asked to write an article for the Mount Angel Abbey newsletter, which was called The Rock. And actually I found that article in the library up there. It's there, which is pretty amazing. She was not actually a very popular speaker, though. She spoke English well, she wrote it well, and she understood it well, but she was not a charming speaker. but she was well received here. While she was here, she was also asked by, and there was a group of European artists, by the way, who had come to New York during the war in order to get out of war Europe. And they were asked by Eleanor Roosevelt to write books to American children about the conditions in their own country. And she wrote a book called
Somewhere in Norway. Something like that.
Happy Days in Norway.
Happy Days in Norway. And it's a delightful book, actually, about her children and life in Lillehammer. And she also wrote a book called Return to the Future, which describes the trip that I just described for you, and and there are some things in there that are really interesting, because she was so angry and so full of hate for the Germans. While she was in the United States, they had taken over her home, and this was also very common, that the Germans would just move into somebody's home, throw out the owners. And they did this to Sigrid's home. They lived there from 1942 until the war was over in 1945. And she hated the thought of the Germans having been there. It was not consistent with her faith for her to have such hate for the Germans. And I think this experience, the fact that the Germans were in her home, was part of what broke her. She came back to Norway as a broken person, and she was not really able to write after the war. She did try. She wrote a book on the Catholic saint, the Italian saint Catherine of Siena, and her manuscript was rejected by her American publisher, which was humiliating for her. In 1997, her home in Lillehammer was sold to the Norwegian government, and I believe that they are in the process of making it into a museum. They might. I'm not so sure. Do you know? Also, no. If it's open yet, but that's the idea. And her son and his family had lived there for some time. Her youngest son Hans has since died, and so the government was able to go in there and look through her home, and she had quite a library. She had 2,000 books, and they also found actually an unfinished manuscript, and that unfinished manuscript, excuse me, has since been published, and it looks like she actually tried to write an autobiography, and it's called 12 Years. Yeah, I don't think it has been translated, but and I'd like to read to you how it ended. I mean, it ends mid-sentence. These are the last her own life for herself as a 12-year-old. She said, she had been learning German in school, and she thought she knew enough of that language now. She could read German books, especially forbidden books. Mother owned a few German novels by a lady calling herself Asep Schubin, and Mother said these books were exaggerated and sentimental bad books. ... That was it. Apparently those were the last words she wrote. She died in Norway in 1949 at the age of 67. And at the end of her life, her love for God and her love for her family were her priorities. Now, I have talked longer than I intended to talk.
So